Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time and coming here. First, a few words about Menas Associates, in case you don't know Menas. Menas has also been around and busy with Iran and a number of other emerging markets. In fact, most of the emerging markets outside North America and Western Europe. And Menas has two distinct divisions. One is publications, and Iran's strategic focus is one of them. In fact, the oldest one now, I think, with more than 30 years of publication, and monthly and also weekly publications. The second division is strategy consulting on various issues where the legal part comes in, and then obviously the strategic, political analysis and consulting services is something Menas offers as well. So with that, let's go into the topic. I want to say at the outset, obviously with all the recent events, especially recent protests, it's very tempting to talk about the domestic situation in Iran and the protests and the clampdown on the protests. But I want to actually stick to the original topic, because this is also important. Our topic is Iran-US relations. What are the potential scenarios in 2020? Some may react and say, well, there is no possibility for any diverse scenario. It will just go on like this. I disagree, and I will tell you why. I mean, let's first just tell you, I will remind all of us of what has happened since May 2012. And it's important to start in sort of 2012, because there was a strategic decision that was very important. Then I will focus a little bit more on the past 6 months, so May 2019 to today. Then try to understand what Trump's objectives have been. It's very difficult to understand it, but we will try together. Then focus on the Macron proposal. There is actually a proposal on the table that could bring the two sides together. I will explain why. Then explain the strategic question, the key strategic question inside Iran. Some other geopolitical developments. Just a few words about the economy. Again, even though it's tempting to spend the whole evening about the economy. And then I will tell you what all of this means, at least from our perspective, for international businesses like yourselves. So one of the key points we have to keep in mind is that ever since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, even though you can sort of say the first decade after the revolution was the war and it was not important, but at least since the 1990s, there are two very distinct approaches to foreign policy in Iran. I call the first one the confrontational approach. It's the approach that defines itself through confronting the West, confronting the US, but also Western interests, and believes, I want to highlight this, believes that Iran will only be taken seriously if it can project military power. This is important to understand when we then come to today to understand what kind of solutions there would be. The second school of thought is what I call the conciliatory approach. This is the approach that says we can actually be taken seriously if we engage the world. We don't have to confront everyone and be in a state of confrontation all the time. There are other ways. The late President Rafsanjani said it once. He said, missiles are important, but diplomacy is also important. And later he said, missiles are important, but diplomacy is actually more important in the new world. And that sort of polarization is what we are dealing still today with. So keep that in mind when we go through this. Yes. So let's just remind ourselves what has happened since 2012. 2012, for those who have forgotten, Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. Rouhani was elected in 2013. The relationship with the West was extremely tense. That was the confrontational approach in power. But, and I am saying this with a lot of certainty, Iran made a strategic decision to improve ties with Europe. That was a strategic decision. The decision was, after a few years of sanctions and pressure and distance from Europe, they realized that still most of the solutions and technologies that Iran needed, even international positioning that Iran needed, would be achieved through a closer relationship with Europe. This was important. And as I said, this decision was made while Ahmadinejad was in power. And as a result, you may know that in March 2013, there were secret negotiations between Iran and the US, because they realized after the failure of the first phase or first wave of nuclear negotiations between 2003 and 2006, they realized that without the US, there would be no resolution of issues with Europe. So secret negotiations, then the whole process was supported in a way, facilitated through the fact that someone from the conciliatory approach became the president. Rouhani became president. Zarif became his foreign minister, someone who at that time had lived most of his life actually in the US rather than in Iran. He was studying there before, and then he became Iran's ambassador at the UN. And in fact, one of the important things was that you may remember that back then, the nuclear file was not in the hands of the foreign ministry. It was actually in the hands of the secretary of the National Security Council in Iran. But the file was taken out of there, was given to the foreign ministry. Zarif became our nuclear negotiator. And we know first they signed the so-called Joint Plan of Action, November of 2013. And later they signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in July 2015. And that was that period Greg was talking about, a lot of positive sort of outlook for business, for relations. The JCPOA was implemented, meaning the different commitments were started in January 2016. And from there to May 2019, and that's a breaking point, Iran was fully complying with the JCPOA commitments. This aspect changed in May, and I will explain why. Until May 2018, the US presidents were also fulfilling their commitments. Both Obama and also Trump, they signed the different waivers. The JCPOA had sort of set out as US commitment that the US president would waive the various secondary sanctions that existed before, so that Iran could trade, especially with Europe. So even President Trump signed those waivers until May 2018. We will come back to what happened there. Obviously, the first shock to the system came when Trump was elected in November 2018. And then the main shock came when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and announced that he will not sign these waivers anymore. And that obviously was a major shock to the system. So US reimposed, starting in May 2018, reimposed a number of those sanctions, in fact, all the secondary sanctions. But until May 2019, there were waivers for 8 countries who were buying Iranian oil. And this is important to understand that up to here, even though it was a shock to the Iranian system, it was still a manageable shock, because Iran was on paper selling oil, and the 3 European countries as signatories to the JCPOA had committed to compensate Iran for the economic loss that the US withdrawal had caused. In fact, the Europeans didn't want the JCPOA, still don't want the JCPOA to collapse. So it was an important factor. How we can describe the situation from May 2018 to May 2019 was US maximum pressure. This is how they termed it themselves. They wanted to really break the Iranian economy against Iran's strategic patience. Iranians were calling their strategy, it's strategic patience. We will wait to see what the Europeans will offer. And if that's interesting, we will stick to the JCPOA and try to sit out Trump. That was really the strategy in this phase. But then what happened? May 2019, the US did not, even though everyone was telling them, including the Europeans, to continue the waivers did not extend those waivers, those oil purchase waivers, and that was the trigger for a new Iranian strategy. In fact, almost immediately, Iran started announcing a withdrawal from its commitments, nuclear commitments. They announced that every 2 months, every 60 days, they will withdraw from a number of their commitments. In fact, throughout the phase we are looking at, from May to today, Iran has gone through 4 phases of, I call it, nuclear escalation. So they have basically withdrawn from their commitments, and with the exception of research and development, which they commenced about 2.5 months ago, which under the JCPOA should have commenced much later, everything else is reversible. So they still, this is the interesting part, the Iranians are withdrawing from the JCPOA to create a cost for the other side, for the Americans and for the Europeans, but in a way that they can reverse whenever the conditions change. As I said, the only thing that is not reversible is the research and development. Other things that happened, so you can also see I have color-coded these boxes a bit. So the red ones are bad, the green ones are good. So in June 2019, Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, came to Tehran in a diplomatic effort to find a way. But the problem for Shinzo Abe was he just came and said, could you have a meeting with President Trump? And the Iranians said, a meeting to achieve what? And they had already experienced the North Korea scenario that you can have a meeting, you can have a photo opportunity, but nothing may come out of it. So this was rejected very quickly. And in response, now that the Iranians had seen that even mediation efforts are not really useful because Trump is only looking for a meeting, for a photo opportunity, they even escalated further. They started, remember all the attacks on the tankers in Fujairah and the seizing of a British tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. This was all, basically you can feel that the conciliatory approach was sort of diminishing and the confrontational approach was taking over and was dictating what Iran should do. Then the US goes to sort of new levels of sanctions. For the first time ever, they actually designated an official army of another country as a terrorist organization, the Revolutionary Guards, which obviously created a lot of new tensions. But on the other side, we see, despite the escalation, we see some de-escalation efforts. Suddenly in July 2019, Senator Rand Paul, who is relatively close to President Trump, he's a Republican as well, meets Javad Zarif in New York and invites him to the White House. He goes out for dinner and says, if you come to the White House tomorrow, the sanctions would be lifted. And then Zarif didn't know how to respond, so he first calls Tehran and they say again, if they want a meeting, they have to lift the sanctions. We just don't we don't want a photo op, we want a real return. Basically, the Iranian strategy, the Iranian response has been, if you want cooperation and a meeting and negotiations for maybe new commitments from the Iranian side, you have to return to the JCPOA. You can't stand outside the JCPOA and instruct the Iranians to commit to new things. So US sanctions craze goes on. They sanctioned Khamenei. As soon as Zarif says, I'm not coming to the White House, he gets sanctioned as well. So you can see how much logic there is in there. So they are talking about diplomacy, but sanctioning Zarif. So it's a lot of irrational things. But then so much was happening that many people didn't notice. But Iran actually made a very interesting proposal. And Zarif termed it the permanent for permanent proposal. He said, if the US is worried, and because this is, in the meantime, this had become the rhetoric of the US side. We are worried about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, and we want to make sure that there is no sunset in the JCPOA, because there are sunsets, but it's actually not on the main thing, which is nuclear weapons. So Zarif made a very interesting proposal. He said, you're worried about nuclear weapons? we will sign the additional protocol to the NPT immediately if the US lifts down all the sanctions. So there would be no sunset. If Iran signs the additional protocol, which Iran is implementing right now, but is not it's not obliged to, then there would be no sunset on Iran developing nuclear weapons. But again, their US response was, we have to have the meeting first, and it didn't really get anywhere, even though I believe this proposal was the most substantial proposal that emerged. But then the so-called Macron proposal came out, and I will show you the details of the Macron proposal in a minute. You may remember Macron suddenly invited Zarif, who had been sanctioned in the meantime by the Americans, to Biarritz to go to the G7 meeting. No Iranian official had ever been invited to the G7 meeting. So you can see the degree of high-level diplomacy that was happening. And the interesting thing was Zarif went there, and again, he had the authority to meet Americans if there would have been an agreement to start a process with lifting the sanctions or returning to the JCPOA. The Iranians in that meeting even made a proposal, which I will come back to, which is very interesting. Again, they said if the US doesn't want to rejoin, there is another process, and that process is still in the works. It's very interesting. I will come back to that. So I mentioned that. But then when that collapsed, Iran escalated again. Iran shot down a US drone and showed that, if the US wants to escalate, Iran is still capable of escalating. And in fact, by this time, a lot of analysts were saying, and it's true, that in a way they were saying the maximum pressure from the US side had maxed out. They had become desperate. They were now sanctioning, like the latest sanction is sanctioning the ICT minister in Iran. It's complete nonsense. I mean, he doesn't have any assets. He doesn't travel anywhere. It's like, well, it sounds nice, as if they're doing something. Whereas the Iranians were escalating with real military material in a way. But then something extremely interesting happens at the UN. Trump agrees with the Macron plan. And we will come back to the Macron plan. And also Rouhani agrees. And the Rouhani-Trump meeting was very close to happening. This is the interesting part. Very close to happening in New York, but they disagreed on sequencing. So Trump wanted to have the meeting first so that he could say, this was my achievement, all of this sort of lifting of sanctions and sort of the new process of negotiations. Whereas Rouhani was saying, I cannot afford to come to a meeting without having the guarantee that the sanctions will be lifted. And then obviously the collapse here and then the recent unrest in Iran have changed the dynamics. I will come back to the outlook, but obviously these unrests can be interpreted in a way that undermines this whole process. On the American side, some people like Mr. Pompeo started saying, see, our sanctions are working, as if the aim of the sanctions was to generate unrest on the Iranian side. Hence, we should not really talk to the Iranians. And on the Iranian side, even the conciliatory faction, it would not be interested in de-escalation when it seems as if they would do it from a position of weakness. And obviously, having gone through these unrests and having gone through the condemnation of the unrest, they will need to feel that they are in a position of strength before anything happens. So this has really undermined the prospect at this stage. And then, as I mentioned, the US added the ICT, the Iranian minister, who they blame for shutting down the internet in Iran, which was completely unprecedented, but it had happened. Now, in these past couple of months, since the UN meeting, where, as I said, the Trump-Rouhani meeting almost happened but failed, French diplomats have talked to both sides. They are still negotiating with both sides about a different sequencing for the Macron proposal. I will come back to that. Just a few other facts. we can describe this. Remember, the previous one was maximum pressure against strategic patience. This is now maximum pressure against Iran's gradual escalation. So if this continues, Iran will escalate to a level where even the Europeans won't be interested in the JCPOA anymore. This is the biggest risk that we are looking at. At the same time, China has played an interesting game. They have continued buying Iranian oil, but exactly to the level that they need to for Iran to pay for its imports from China. So on average, about €1 billion a month of Chinese goods are exported to Iran, and roughly €1 billion of Iranian oil and condensate is being bought by Chinese refineries. So it's a clear game of keeping the door open, keeping the trade with Iran, but only to the level that satisfies their demands rather than satisfying the Iranian need for money and exports. In the meantime, the EU has failed miserably in developing this so-called INSTEX, the payment mechanism, and that has been a big disappointment for the Iranians. So in the sort of strategic choices that Iran will have when we will come back, they don't really believe the EU can do anything unless something positive happens with the Macron proposal. So that's why we have to look at the Macron proposal in a minute. But very quickly, I mean, we all know Trump is an unpredictable person. And one thing that I found out through interviews in Washington is that there is right now absolutely no policy-making process in Washington. Things happen through a tweet or through a couple of meetings, and then a process gets started, and then the same way it emerges, it can also disappear. But how it started in early 2018, remember Trump said that he will not, when he signed the waivers in January 2018, he said that was the last time I'm signing it. And then it seemed from all the different messages that were coming out that the main objective was to weaken Iran's strategic position in the region. In a way, many, including Saudi Arabia and others in the region, they felt that Obama policies had strengthened Iran, especially the JCPOA. And Trump, in a way, a Trump administration wanted to weaken Iran's regional position. I won't even go into the 12 demands that Pompeo listed. That was a real political joke, and we shouldn't waste time on it. Then came Bolton around May 2018, and he started saying, this regime is about to collapse. And remember his speech where he said, by Christmas 2018, we will celebrate in Tehran. That much of illusion in the heads of Bolton, but that suddenly changed the process. It looked as if the real intention is for a regime collapse in Iran, a regime change, and hence intensifying maximum pressure. Interestingly, until May 2019, until the time when Iran was still fully compliant with the JCPOA, the Americans could have declared victory. They could have said, see, we have limited Iran's financial resources, but Iran's still compliant with the JCPOA, so we have the best of both worlds. But then they became greedy, in my view. They became greedy and they did not extend those waivers. That's when Iran realized, now we have to increase the cost to the other side. And you know what they did. I mean, if you compare it to the situation in January 2017, even January 2018, Iran is enriching more uranium now. It has more centrifuges in place. It's testing missiles against the defiance of all the external and regional powers. It has a much wider regional network of proxies. It's attacking targets in the region, and in a way, through those attacks, all the regional powers, especially the Arab countries, have sort of tried to de-escalate with Iran. And sort of as if the confrontational approach is actually paying off. I mean, that's at least definitely the debate inside Iran. And Iran has also continuously arrested dual nationals to challenge the US. And in a way, for me, all of those dual nationals that had been arrested are hostages. It's really the continuation of the hostage rationale that they used also throughout the 80s and 90s. Then suddenly in June 2019, that's just before Shinzo Abe came to Tehran, in Tokyo, Trump turned around and said, all I want to make sure is that there are no nuclear weapons. It's very interesting. So you go from changing the regional balance to toppling the regime, and suddenly all I want to know is that there are no nuclear weapons. It's very interesting. Within 24 hours, Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei, in a public speech, said, I am against nuclear weapons, it's against our religion, and for the first time he said, I even have advisors, this is Khamenei speaking, he said, some of my advisors tell me we should develop nuclear weapons but never use them. He said, I'm even against that. And that was the first time when Khamenei was actually talking to Trump, because he had said no nuclear weapons. He was saying, as long as I'm around, there will be no nuclear weapons in Iran. And so you could feel a first sort of public dialogue emerging, and you can imagine that there was a lot of discussion in different fora in the UN and so on. And also Pompeo had moved from his 12 demands to suddenly saying, we are prepared to negotiate without any preconditions. So you look at this has happened within 2 years, 18 months, and you can sort of have sympathy for the confrontational approach in Iran, who says, we can't trust these guys. I mean, they don't even have a strategy, they don't know what they want. Nonetheless, all of those things that I mentioned, the Rand Paul Zarif meeting, the almost Trump Rouhani meeting in September, so the desire has been there. And interestingly, in June, July of this year, when I was studying the situation, everyone was saying, as long as Bolton is there, nothing will happen. And suddenly Bolton departed, as if like this was the precondition, let's get rid of him, and now we can. So it's interesting how the situation has evolved, and I have no doubt, for Trump at least, there are obviously other players, but for Trump, I have no doubt that all he wants to achieve is a new deal with his signature, and that new deal could actually be the exact same old deal, but he can claim, I did it. I resolved the issue that no other president has managed to resolve. So this is the type of situation we have, but as I said, the sequencing is a problem. So what is Macron's proposal? So Macron, and I want to underline this is the last sort of European attempt to save the JCPOA. If this fails, the JCPOA could potentially collapse within the next year. So he has prepared a plan where he has asked the Iranians to agree to never acquire a nuclear weapon. So this is response to Trump saying, I want to make sure that there are no nuclear weapons. And Iran would more or less commit to this by signing the additional protocol and allowing snap inspections in Iran's nuclear facilities. And then return to the full compliance of the nuclear obligations. But also, and this is important, to negotiate a long-term framework for nuclear activities, and very carefully they have inserted in there regional issues without mentioning missiles, because if they would have mentioned missiles, Iran would have not agreed. But regional issues, hoping that maybe if we get into a negotiation, sanctions are lifted, we could also talk about missiles. On the other side, Washington would agree to lift all the sanctions that were introduced since 2017, so since basically Trump got into power, and to commit, because this is one part that was written into the JCPOA but not really fully implemented, because the banking sector remained very challenging for Iran-related business. Iran was selling oil in 2017, 2018, but was, had a lot of difficulties repatriating its money because of the hesitation of banks and so on. So to change the dynamics of the implementation of the JCPOA, not just return to the JCPOA, but also fully implement the banking aspects. In short, basically a return to January 2017, but with the additional US commitment that banks will not be harassed and Iran can sell. Because remember, in 2017, American officials were going around the world and telling everyone, stop buying Iranian oil and stop transferring Iranian money and so on, which was completely against the JCPOA agreement. So, obviously one aspect of this was also to establishing France, and this is not the only proposal. You know, Macron has worked on de-escalating with Russia, on a new concept for the European Union, so he really wants to present France as a world power, but this is one of those aspects where he would have been in a very interesting position. And as I said, I've heard it from both sides. That meeting almost happened, but the problem was sequencing. And now, all the additional negotiations that are going on are focusing on changing the sequencing. How can you change the sequencing? Trump could theoretically offer some waivers before the meeting. Imagine Trump offers waivers to Japan and South Korea for buying Iranian oil and condensate. Then the meeting happens, and then the rest of the steps that the Macron proposal is proposing. This way, the Iranians can say, see, the Americans are de-escalating, they are returning to the JCPOA, hence the meeting. And Rouhani has said it many times. He has said, if I know that a meeting will help my country, I will go to that meeting. He has not hidden his desire to actually for this to happen, but obviously he cannot attend that meeting without some sort of a guarantee that the sanctions will be lifted. Now, interestingly, to show you that the Iranians are serious, Iran has communicated to France that if Trump doesn't want to return or lift the sanctions to return to the JCPOA, let's do it this way. Europe gives Iran a 15 billion euro, and there is a calculation for this credit line. In a way, the European side pre-purchases 5 months of Iranian oil exports, and the two sides start negotiating. Now, if things go well, after 5 months, another tranche of 15 billion comes into the picture, and the negotiations continue. If the negotiations fail, they failed, and they're where they are. Nothing has happened. Europe just has a credit in oil that it can lift from Iran whenever it has the freedom to do so. Now, this has sort of not materialized because France wants Trump's full commitment to this. Because again, we will be talking about banks transferring money. And if the American sanctions on those banks come into the play, it will be announced but not materialized. So this is and this is how we have come back to the waivers. So now the French are talking to the Americans saying, instead of approving this credit line, give some waivers so that other countries can buy Iranian oil and create a new positive momentum. So this is where we are. What does this mean for Iran? Iran, I told you, this is what's important. In 2012, Iran made a strategic choice to re-establish ties. They were not focused on the US with Europe, but they knew that having negotiations with the Americans is part of the package. Now, what Trump has, and back then, the hardliners, the confrontational mind was saying, forget about it, we can't trust the Americans. Rouhani and Zarif came back in 2015 and said, look, we have signed it and the Americans have signed it. Unfortunately, what Trump has done has vindicated the hardliners. You can't trust the Americans, hence now the strategic choice right now is basically, do you go along with the confrontational approach, which wants to dismiss the significance of the West and focus on others, or do you still try with the conciliatory approach? And I can tell you this has not been decided fully. If it would have been decided, Rouhani and Zarif would have not been engaged with the French and the Europeans. They would have exited the JCPOA. In fact, Iran has been very clear that if the JCPOA collapses, they will also exit the NPT. And Iran would have already been very firmly in the sort of Asian, Russian corner with those types of the view of the confrontational approach, of the hardline. So it hasn't been decided. And the final decision, in my view, will depend on so many issues. Fact is, the confrontational approach is more dominant. You can see that in some of the statements, you can see that in some of the actions. But there are other aspects, other events that will make a change, make a difference. The fallout from the recent protests in Iran. It's Iran, in an interesting way, even though it has clamped down on the protests, on dissent and so on, there is still a desire to have a degree of legitimacy. And these protests have challenged the regime's legitimacy. So the question is, how do you re-establish that legitimacy? Rouhani has been talking a lot about a referendum. He feels that a referendum could re-establish some legitimacy, that not about the regime, but referendum about some of the administrative issues and other issues. If we have time in question and answers, I will go into more details. We have Majlis elections, parliamentary elections in February 2020. The outcome of that election can change the political composition. Then we have presidential elections, and then there are a lot of important debates about the succession to the supreme leader. And there is a scenario where they actually designate the successor. He doesn't have to die. Usually, the law says that after his either dismissal or demise, they have to elect the successor. But we have had it in the 80s that there was a designated successor to the supreme leader, and that debate could also play a role. So there is no doubt that the conciliatory faction in the moderates in Iran are in a weaker position. And if they lose the next Majlis elections, it will be very challenging for them to revive the idea of the Macron proposal or maybe some sort of a de-escalation. And there is also another obstacle that's important, which is the Iranian society even is not that much interested in engagement anymore. Don't forget, the Iranian society did the right things. They elected Rouhani, they supported engagement, they re-elected Rouhani. Everything, was going in the conciliatory approach. But the US, the Trump administration's response was dismissing the whole thing. Hence the idea, maybe the confrontational approach, maybe the hardliners are, maybe they have figured out how we have to do it. And in fact, I have absolutely no doubt, if we did an opinion poll today in Iran, the most popular public face will be Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. Because people say he keeps his promises. He told us he will stop ISIS from entering Iran, and he did. Look at Iran's influence in Iraq, look at Iran's influence in the region. So that is the more efficient approach, not the engagement approach. So we have a difficult situation, and if the hardliners win the parliament in February, which is very likely right now, it will be another period of Ahmadinejad style policies in Iran, which is very sad. So, in the interest of time, I will just go through this very quickly. You know most of it. US withdrawal from the region has created a lot of anxieties. You saw that in the case of Syria. It's happening in many other cases. The relationship between UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran are moving in the de-escalatory direction, which is also interesting. And in a way, it's as if like these two powers have reacted to Iran's escalation by de-escalating. And my explanation for that is, I believe our region sort of reached its threshold of violence, especially with the attacks on Saudi Aramco. And that moment you felt that everyone wants to de-escalate. The UAE immediately started talking to Iran about navigation security and so on. And look at what's happening in Yemen. There are some positive signals that both Iran and Saudi Arabia want to resolve the Yemen issue. And also, interestingly, Iran and the EU have had negotiations about the situation in Yemen, which again is an indication that Iran is ready to talk about other topics if the JCPOA is fully operational. There are obviously on other regional, like the resurgence of ISIS, the resurgence of Taliban. These are all important things, and we should never forget those types of interests are actually common interests between Iran and the US. Pushing back against extremism is important. Iran has also introduced a framework for de-escalating with the Persian Gulf countries. It's called Hormuz Peace Endeavor, HOPE. Interestingly, the first reactions haven't been negative. Russia is playing a more active role in our region, and Iran has signed a preferential trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, which gives you an indication of which direction the country will take if the relations with Europe collapse. And obviously China, as I mentioned, is important, and there is obviously a third dimension to Iran-China and US-China, and that's the US-China trade war. And depending on what happens there, China can play one role or the other. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the economy too much, but I just want to tell you the Iranian economy has suffered extensively over 2 years. About 11% of the economy has been wiped off through these sanctions. But it is returning, even by the admission of the World Bank. The economy will return to modest growth next year. So Iran, in a way, is reviving its economy, even though there is a lot of inflation and there is a lot of unemployment. But Iran has the resilience, in my view, to resist the current situation, even though it's not as strong as before. It is not going to collapse in a way. Those in the US who said with these sanctions the Iranian economy will collapse, then the regime will collapse, those are all, in my view, illusions in a way. So, if we describe the current scenario, current situation with Iran and the US as no war and no diplomacy, then let's ask ourselves what can happen. Because none of the two, even the more hardline elements on both sides, none of them want war. This is important to understand. So a military confrontation between Iran and the US, an all-out confrontation, is a very unlikely scenario. Peace, in a way that it happens within 2020, is also very unlikely scenario because there are still so many grievances. And I want to underline, I'm focusing on 2020. 2021, there may be a new president in the US. It may be a completely different dynamics regionally. So just 2020. Let's just try to focus on 2020. The most likely scenario is the continuation of the status quo, which means the US will sanction the rest of the Iranian ministers over the next few months, and the Iranians will use different situations to escalate. The facilitators of that process would be the moderates lose the Majlis elections, meaning the hardliners will be in a better position to escalate, and Iran will further escalate. And as I said, if Iran further escalates the nuclear issue, the JCPOA will collapse, and potentially Iran will also leave the NPT, which is very sad, also for international relations. There is a very small likelihood that there will be a Trump-Rouhani meeting before the Majlis elections. Rouhani would love this. This would be the savior of the moderates in Iran, because if there is even an announcement of a potential meeting, it can change the dynamics of the Majlis elections, of the parliamentary elections. The best signpost we can pick up is if the Iranians and the Americans release some of their prisoners. That would be a signpost that something is happening. This is a goodwill gesture, releasing a couple of the prisoners on the Iranian side, a couple of the prisoners on the US side. But there could be also rhetorical de-escalation, and Trump suddenly issues waivers. If Trump issues waivers, you can be very sure that the new version of the Macron proposal is emerging. So waivers, meeting, sanctions release. There could also be a situation where the Trump-Rouhani meeting is pushed to the fall of 2020. That would be more useful to Trump, because Trump wants to come out and say, I'm this international power broker, and I have resolved the Iranian issue, and we're going to sign a new agreement. This could really happen if somehow the moderates win the parliamentary elections in Iran. The only way the moderates can win the election if there is some sort of a momentum in favor of the moderates. As I said, it could be a referendum to increase legitimacy and so on. Obviously, there's also a scenario of further escalation, even though, as I said, none of them want a war, but there is potential for further escalation. Iranian proxies in Iraq or in other countries could do something against American interests or against American allies, and that can lead to new actions by the US. So my analysis is the first scenario is the most likely scenario, but we should not completely dismiss the other three, whereas this one, if really the French diplomats increase their creativity, can also happen. So just look out for the signposts. These signposts, as I said, rhetorical de-escalation. It can happen, and we have seen it before. Interestingly, one phrase of the Macron proposal, where he talks about, like the Macron proposal talks about sustainable long-term peace and stability in the region, made it into Trump's UN speech. So there are phrases that can be communicated from both sides, even though, as I said, it's right now not the most likely scenario. So what does it mean for international business? First of all, despite all the hiccups, Iran-EU business is continuing. We should not sort of dismiss the idea that this is going to lead to. There is still about 5-6 billion euro of annual trade between Iran and the EU, despite all the difficulties, payment difficulties, sanctions, issues, and so on. So obviously there is a focus on non-sanctioned business. The key bottleneck is financial transactions, and I'm sure most of you know about that. But there are still, even though Instex hasn't become operational, a number of mini Instexes, mini SPVs are working and are operational. Even though Europe is still, and that's why the trade is continuing, Europe is still the backbone of the Iranian industry, Chinese companies are very quickly offering alternatives, including some spare parts for European machinery that they are offering to the Iranians to increase their own potential for business. As I said, the most likely scenario, continuation of status quo, but there could be a breakthrough. As I said, the signposts will show it to us. The recent proposals have created a lot of confusion on both sides. As I said, the Americans will say this is a sign that the regime is collapsing. Some of the Iranians will say this is not a good time to engage. But as I said, we should not dismiss the possibility. One important aspect of the developments in Iran is no matter what happens, no matter which one of these two scenarios, these two factions gain the upper hand, the Revolutionary Guards are here to stay. We should never think about a scenario that because of US sanctions or because of conciliatory approach gaining out the upper hand, the RGC is going to go. No, they are one of the most significant components of power in Iran, and the more pressure you put on Iran as sort of from the Western perspective, the more they will consolidate their position, and that obviously is a challenge in the long run. So if there is no thaw in Iran-US relations, it will further consolidate Russia's position in Iran. Even though China is important, but China is more ambivalent about a strategy towards Iran compared to Russia. So, and one thing, because Russia is important, also because Turkey is important, I have encouraged companies to look at so-called triangle solutions. So there are triangle solutions. You could develop ideas in third countries and still remain in touch with the opportunities in the Iranian market. So I'm going to stop here, and We have till 7:15. No, is that right? So we have half an hour for questions or comments, or so. Please go ahead. Thank you.